Hello, everybody. Welcome to this evening's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. I'm Chesa Boudin. I'm a lawyer. I'm the former San Francisco District Attorney, and I'm currently the founding executive director of the Criminal Law and Justice Center at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. Tonight, I'll be talking with Nell Bernstein about her new book, In Our Future, We Are Free. The book chronicles the movement to close youth prisons. A few reminders before we get started. Tonight's program is being recorded, so we kindly ask that you silence your cell phones for the duration of our program. Now, before we get started, let me tell you a little bit more about our speaker. Nell Bernstein is the author of Burning Down the House, winner of the American Bar Association's Silver Gavel Award, and All Alone in the World, Children of the Incarcerated, and her latest book, which we're here to discuss tonight and which she'll be around afterwards to sign copies of, which are available for purchase, In Our Future, We Are Free, The Dismantling of the Youth Prison. Nell is a former Soros Justice Media Fellow, a McDowell Fellow, and winner of the White House Champion of Change Award. Her articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many other publications. Please join me in welcoming Nell Bernstein.
Thank
you. Now, before we jump in to asking Nell questions and hearing more about the book, I just want to set the stage and acknowledge that we are living through a tremendously difficult time in this country's history. And if it wasn't already obvious and apparent to all of us, the shooting and killing of Renee Good in Minneapolis a few days ago made it painfully so. I know that all of us are thinking about the injustice that's being perpetrated, the violence, the state oppression, and the ways in which we can engage as responsible, caring citizens committed to democracy, civil society, human rights. It's a big topic. It's not one that we're going to be able to take on tonight, but it's one that I think in many ways is connected to the work that Nell has done over her career. And so let me just start, if I could, Nell, by asking you to share the origin story of the movement that you've chronicled with so much of your writing and in this book.
Sure. Thank you for that. One thing I learned in researching this book is that movements are only coherent in retrospect. When they're happening, you don't see all the pieces moving at once. So when we tell stories like, Rosa Parks was tired, that's not how movements start. But the other thing that was abundantly clear to me is that I don't think there's a movement in the history of the world, really, that wasn't started and led by those most impacted. And when you're talking about kids who are incarcerated, that was, immensely difficult. So there's not one origin story, but here in California, I feel like a spark was really lit when a group of young people who were being held on disciplinary lockdown units inside the California Youth Authority, so sort of dungeons within dungeons where they had little to no contact with the outside world, with their families, round-the-clock lockdown, began writing letters to a woman named Sue Burrell, who, although I cannot see any of you, I'm pretty sure is here. So yeah. So bear with me, Sue. But these guys, they not only wrote to her, and I don't know if you guys know this about Sue, but before she was a lawyer, she was a librarian. So she saved all their letters, and 30-some years later, she shared them with me, these boxes of handwritten letters. And they were so overwhelming. The handwriting was shaky, because a lot of the times they were writing with just a smuggled pencil stub, or in one or two cases, just a shard of lead. And they described a level of brutality that I don't actually think I want to detail right now, except to say that it was in great part thanks to the efforts of Sue and others like her. It was later confirmed by court monitors and all kinds of investigators. And a lot of what they talked about I was familiar with from the reporting I did for my last book, Burning Down the House, which is a reported argument against youth incarceration. But these kids also described a practice I had never heard of, which is that guards would duct tape their cells so that no air could get in, and then throw a chemical grenade into the cell of a young person who had, I don't know, committed an infraction or annoyed a guard or something. And that was shocking enough to, I always think I can't be shocked at this point, and then I am. So I did a little digging, and I found an interview with the superintendent at the time. And when a reporter asked her about this practice, she didn't deny it. She didn't defend it. She just explained that it was, in her words, a creative solution to the problem of guards being forced to inhale these toxic chemicals that had been intended for people she referred to as wards. And I use that word just because I think one of the things that prisons depend on is dehumanization. And, you know, Chesa mentioned what's going on today. Obviously, this is an ongoing thing. But these guys, I mean, not only did they fight back, when I say that they were activists, they were really organizing in there. Like at one, you probably remember this, Sue, but she gave me a manila envelope that was bursting at the seams because one young man had, even under these conditions of absolute lockdown, managed to gather letters from other young men on his unit and get them to his mom, who got them to Sue. One guy, while he was trapped in this kind of blinding chemical fog, had managed to write down not just the name, but the serial number of the grenade that was used against him so that, as he said in his letter, they can't say I made it up. Another kid had enclosed a few pages of the ward's rights handbook and numbered his concerns to correspond with each provision that was being violated. Another one did the same thing with the Constitution. But I think what stood out to me most was how frequently they used the pronoun we. Like, we need our rights respected. We need some outside help. And I felt like by doing that, they were not just asserting their humanity, which no child should be forced to do, but children who are so dehumanized, that is part of their task that we've given them as activists. They were asserting a shared humanity. And I think that's the foundation of movement building and of organizing. So to my mind, that's the origin story. And I think it happened in places around the country that I just don't know about.
Thank you for that, Nell. And before we dig in more detail to the issues you take on in the book, we talked about where the movement in your book came from. I want to talk a little bit about where we're going. What are the goals you have for the book?
Yeah. I mean, that's really changed for me because I started writing the book in 2020. And at the time, I think I just thought of it as a love letter to activists, people I had met along the way of 20 years of reporting on this, and maybe something that would be useful as a tool for people who were involved in youth justice or criminal justice. But that, I mean, honestly, I would say that changed for me on November 7th of 2024, because I go, I don't know if these folks are in the room, but, oh, they are, yes. Every year, I'm invited to speak to a law school class at UC Berkeley, which I love doing, and Laura Rodolfi, who's one of the teachers of that class, I think is over there. And I always look forward to it, but on this post-election night, I got there and, there were just these young faces looking so helpless and kind of bereft that I felt like I didn't really have anything to offer them. But as we got into our conversation, because I essentially, just scrapped my notes and we just talked, I did start to feel like the book had something for them and for other people who were feeling that way, because the book is about all kinds of activists, but I think the heart of the movement I describe, which, by the way, is a movement that has reduced youth incarceration by 75%. At my last event, my editor told me I left that out. And closed 2/3 of our youth prisons, so a very successful movement. I think young people and their parents are the heart of that movement. Many other people were involved, but they're the heart of it. And as I spoke to that law school class on that night, I was looking at a bunch of people who I think were facing this terrifying prospect of living under the rule of an authoritarian system. And I realized that the people in my book, that wasn't abstract for them. They were literally living that reality every day. And they still found ways to resist. And it took a very long time, but it's been tremendously successful. So I guess now I hope that maybe the book will, if not have concrete lessons for people trying to figure out what the hell resistance means in this moment, at least show that it is possible.
You've been documenting these and related issues for years. You started this book in 2020. I mentioned in your bio books that you previously published. And I should also say that one of the staff attorneys who works for me at the center I lead at Berkeley, who couldn't be here tonight, sent me with 2 earmarked and what do you call those, color-coded, flat, page markers, and begged me to have Nell sign those previous books. So Nell's work is renowned, it's impactful, and her books are accessible to lawyers and practitioners as well as a more mainstream audience. That's a unique attribute in a writer and an author. So thank you for creating that accessibility and also that utility for people like my staff attorney who are practicing in this space.
Thank you.
I say that not only to compliment you, well-deserved and appropriate, but also because, as you say, over the last 5 years, the moment we're in has really changed. I know that. I was district attorney of San Francisco 5 years ago. I'm not anymore.
Remember that.
So things certainly have changed. And I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about the longer-term perspective. I feel like the students I work with at Berkeley who are younger and maybe don't remember the heyday of tough on crime policies in the 90s, feel like all is lost right now and maybe lose sight of that statistic you gave us a moment ago. And if you could give us a little bit of perspective about, yes, things are bad, but where, how far have we come and how much have we gone backwards?
Okay, yeah, thanks for asking that, because I did try to squeeze it in there. But so in the late 90s and early 2000s, which were the height of the so-called super predator era, I was editing a youth newspaper in downtown San Francisco. How bad were things? There were 100,000 kids. Nope, this was a typo that your colleague caught. There were 10,000 kids in the California Youth Authority. There were 100,000 kids incarcerated nationwide. And I mean, you would see the super predator trope. There's just no overstating how powerful it was. All the news weeklies, remember news weeklies, had these glowering black kids on the cover, and my staff would come to work in our downtown office, and this is what drew me into this issue. They would get stopped by the police and often arrested on their way. And I think when you mentioned Minneapolis, there were gang injunctions that allowed the police, under cover of law, to pick you up based on the color of your skin, what you were wearing, who you were associating with, and where you were. So you didn't need probable cause for any particular crime. Nobody was out blowing whistles to protect these kids. It was a really bleak time. Now, the number of kids behind bars is about, the numbers always lag by a bit, but about 27,000. As I said, 2/3 of these places have closed. So I think the real question, and it is a live question, is are we going to go back? Because there is a backlash brewing. I think these changes are institutionalized to a degree that we won't go back to where we were. But the other thing I learned about movements is that they have to keep moving. We can't say that we've won civil rights or women's rights or gay, so I do think we have to keep going.
I want to follow up on the statistics and share sort of an anecdote from my time in San Francisco politics, which is that a lot of that work of reducing juvenile detention had happened before I took office. I mean, a lot of that trend began and huge strides had been made to reduce the number of kids in San Francisco's juvenile detention center before I was sworn in. In fact, the Board of Supervisors voted, I think it was unanimously or close to unanimously, to close San Francisco's juvenile hall in 2019 before I was elected. Didn't happen, but they voted to do it. During my time in office, we managed to reduce juvenile incarceration by another 70% on top of that. We got down to a very, very small number of kids in our detention center on any given day. And we can talk about why we didn't get down to zero if people are interested later. But the question I have is really about the importance of treating kids as kids. Because one of the things that would have actually made it easier, and this is counterintuitive, so bear with me for a minute, it would have made it easier for us to get to zero in juvenile hall if we had charged the most serious crimes committed by kids as adults, if we tried to transfer them from juvenile hall over to the adult jail and courthouse. That's something that my successor in office, Brooke Jenkins, is doing on a regular basis. It's something that's becoming popularized and happening with increasing frequency across the state. Now, when we got down to just 7 or 8 kids in juvenile hall, they were all there either on a very, very serious case, like a murder, which today the DA would seek to transfer to juvenile hall, from juvenile hall to adult court, or they were there for a day or two after getting picked up on a warrant while we made arrangements for their release to a non-custodial setting. It was, on any given day, there were a few of those kids there, but it wasn't a stable, ongoing incarceration. So I guess I'm wondering for you, there's a certain tension between saying we want to close juvenile hall on the one hand, and we don't want to prosecute kids as adults. I had a clear, bright line as DA. I never did, and I never would ever prosecute a kid as an adult for the same reason we don't let people who are 14 enroll in the military or vote or buy cigarettes. I mean, they're kids. Their brains aren't developed. Their decision-making is impaired. And we understand that in all these other areas of legislation and public policy. But often there's this disconnect when it comes to crime and public safety where they say, well, the crime was really bad, and therefore, even though we know they're a kid, we're going to treat them as an adult. The question I have for you is how do you grapple with that tension between wanting to treat kids as kids and also recognizing that some kids do commit horrific crimes that demand accountability and a political response?
Yeah, no, I'm really glad that you asked that because I think we often don't ask that and don't pay enough attention to the harm that crime does. But that tension that you described, so when I started working on this book, I heard from a lot of people, and so California closed its whole state youth prison system in 2022. They voted to close it in 2020, and when that happened, there was a lot of concern that that would lead to a serious uptick in the number of youth tried as adults. And that's been true across the country, that fear that if judges don't have that tough option of a state youth prison, they'll try more kids as adults. What's actually happened since 2000 is the number of kids sentenced as adults has dropped by more than 80%. So an even greater drop. I should add also that this is because of a movement, but also youth crime has dropped by 75%. So interestingly enough, I mean, there are a handful of DAs in California who are dead set on trying kids as adults. After that Doge kid allegedly got carjacked in DC, Congress passed a law that lowered the age at which DC kids could be tried as adults. 6 or 7 states have done the same thing. So that's definitely where the backlash is, but we're in a much better place there too. In terms of your question, what do you do when a kid really commits harm? I'm gonna quote our mutual friend Imani Davis because I was really struggling as this book came out with how to talk about that. And she said, and it's just so simple and obvious, like, yeah, sometimes a kid needs to be sat down for a while. What they don't need is to be isolated and tortured. And if you know about the conditions inside our youth prisons, I don't know why I don't feel like getting into but kids die in there. Kids are in around-the-clock solitary confinement. In Los Angeles Juvenile Hall right now, where kids were sent for therapeutic treatment after we closed the state system. How many guards are facing criminal charges for starting gladiator fights? I mean, yeah, sometimes a kid needs to be taken off the street so that other people don't get hurt. but they don't need to be put in a place where they will be so deeply traumatized that there's a robust body of evidence showing that that intervention is going to lead to more criminality as an adult.
I want to talk about a related topic, which is something, and I'll just, again, start by sharing an anecdote. I grew up in Chicago, and my adoptive mother, who raised me while my biological parents were in prison, dedicated her life to juvenile justice. And she founded the Children and Family Justice Center at Northwestern Law School, and we would spend the morning on Thanksgiving Day throughout my childhood going to juvenile detention in Chicago and serving Thanksgiving dinner to the young kids who were incarcerated there. And one of the things that always struck me before I'd become a lawyer, before I'd been formally educated even, was that every single kid in juvenile detention in Chicago, and this is true in San Francisco and has been for years, was black or brown.
Right.
And I know we talk a lot about race or we should, and we generally do in any conversation about the criminal justice system, but the disparities are even more visible and egregious in juvenile detention.
That's right.
And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the role that plays, both in allowing the kind of so-called super predator memes to feed into legislation, and also in allowing the dehumanization and the kind of conditions that you were just describing a moment ago.
Yeah, I mean, it's everything. There's this term that is used in the field, racial disparities. That's not even remotely a strong enough term for what's happening. It's racial targeting. And one of the really difficult things is that although really good people have been trying to fight this for many years, as the number of kids incarcerated has dropped, the proportion who are black has risen. So that what Chesa is describing of going into an institution and seeing only black, or in California, because of our demographics, black and brown faces is, I mean, I went into a prison in Washington State that had a bunch of white people in it, and it was confusing. Like, if you've been into these places, it's just not what you see. So yeah, I mean, I feel like the two things that these places depend on to exist are invisibility. They do a really good job of keeping, the kind of walls and gates and razor wire that keep some people in, also keep the rest of us out. I think everybody should probably be serving breakfast in juvenile hall because we just don't know who's in there or what's happening. But yeah, I don't know what to say besides race is the whole story. It's not sort of a side effect. It's what we're doing. And, what you said about dehumanization, that's another word for racism. And there's research showing that when people are shown pictures of a black kid and a white kid, they think the black kid is older. It just operates in so many areas.
I want to ask a question about what works. Let me preface it by saying, because we know what doesn't work: dehumanizing people, caging kids,
right?
Expecting that somehow after years of solitary confinement and abuse, kids we release now as 25-year-olds are going to somehow magically be able to integrate. We know that doesn't work. It's obvious. It's intuitive to anybody who pays close attention. I think we also know that part of what's necessary is zealous defense for kids on the front end. Mm-hmm. We happen to have in the audience today Patty Lee, who has led the San Francisco Public Defender's juvenile team for decades. Zealous advocacy on behalf of young people, the kind of advocacy not only that we're all entitled to in a courtroom if we're accused of a crime, but that so many of these young people don't have at home or in school in ways that lead them into the juvenile justice system in the first place, is essential. But we also know that some significant percentage of those kids, no matter how zealous their advocacy, will end up in some kind of detention. What works in that context, and what do alternatives to detention for youth who've committed serious offenses look like?
Right. And initially, I actually thought that would be half of the book, that half of the book would talk about this movement and half of the book would talk about what safety and justice and accountability, which are the things that prisons promise us, would look like outside of prisons. The first part just got too long and kind of ate the second half, but there are a couple of chapters.
So you're telling us there's another book in the works? That's what I hear. Is that what you all hear?
If there were to be one, that's what it would be.
Good.
That's all I'm willing to
Fair.
But, honestly, that question of if not prisons, what? I've tackled that twice. I looked at it in Burning Down the House, and I look at it again in this book, and I feel like I got it wrong the first time. Because in Burning Down the House, I interviewed a lot of experts, and I asserted that the alternative to incarcerating kids was alternatives to incarceration. In other words, programs. This time around, I asked a different question, and I got a different answer. When I asked people who had been raised in systems and institutions what they wanted for their children, what they thought would create safety in their neighborhoods, I did not hear the word programs once. I heard words like schools and parks and playgrounds and sports and summer camp. Like, you have kids, right?
2 of them.
Do you want a program for your kid? None of us want programs for our kids. And I realized that asserting that was what other kids needed. So this time around, I looked at what community organizations and sometimes just neighborhoods are doing to keep themselves safe. And the Bay Area is a great place to look at that. I looked pretty closely at a place I love and have been involved with for probably a quarter century now, called the Young Women's Freedom Center. Okay.
And where our mutual friend Imani Davis is now in a leadership role.
Yes. And where those of you who are from Alameda County, our congressional representative, Latifah Simon, was essentially the founding director as a teenager. And what they do is very straightforward. They get girls out of juvenile hall and out of the street economy. They're expanding now into things like community-owned housing and community-run businesses, which I'm also seeing across the country. People want to, for lack of a better term, own the means of production. They're tired of petitioning the government for solutions. But what I love about that place is that you can walk in off the street and just get what you need, whether that's a hot meal and a hug or a job or help applying for a driver's license or a deep historical and political education that might take you from blaming yourself for your struggles to feeling a kind of self-efficacy. I think that's the answer. And I think whatever the answer is, you shouldn't have to break the law to access it.
Let me just reflect on that for a minute before I ask you another question. I mean, as a father of 2 very young boys, thinking about public safety, wanting to live in a safe community, I don't picture the ideal neighborhood. I live in the Outer Sunset, for those who are curious, but I don't picture the ideal neighborhood as one where there's a blue light camera on every corner,
Right, exactly.
or where we hear police sirens often. I picture a neighborhood with parks, not programs.
Yeah.
I picture a neighborhood with good public schools and with lots of outdoor green space for kids to play, and with lots of other kids who can run around freely and be silly and goofy and make mistakes without being labeled gang members.
That's right.
When I was a San Francisco public defender, we saw cases prosecuted as gang cases where the only alleged connection or gang activity between people was that they grew up in the same neighborhood. Sometimes they were cousins, and they posed with silly faces or hand gestures and Instagram photos with each other.
Right.
But those kids grew up in neighborhoods where they literally couldn't walk from their house to school or get on the bus without being stopped and searched by police.
Exactly.
I don't think over-policing in that way makes us safer. I think it actually makes us less safe, because that, along with mass incarceration, starves the neighborhoods we grow up in and we raise our families in of exactly the things we all want to feel safe.
Right.
We don't invest in parks. We don't invest in basketball courts or baseball diamonds. We don't invest in public libraries anymore, for example. The kinds of things. My son loves going to the public library, and too many poor neighborhoods in America spend more money on policing and surveillance than they do on access to books and arts and crafts.
That's exactly it.
When I was growing up on the south side of Chicago, a mostly black neighborhood, I was in a baseball league. And the league was in a small park near my house. And I remember when I was in Pee Wee League, being in uniform during a game, sitting on the bench waiting for my turn to go to bat, and we heard gunshots ring out on the other side of the park. And there was a drive-by shooting at the basketball courts, just across from the baseball diamonds. This is in the 90s. The way the city responded to that drive-by shooting at the basketball courts was so typical of the narrow.
They closed the courts,
They
right?
closed the courts.
Yeah.
They took down the hoops.
Yeah.
That was the collective punishment response. And it was apparently the most creative, imaginative way that the local elected officials at the time could think of to say, we're doing something to promote safety.
We're
But-
going to deprive you in order to make you more safe.
We're going to eliminate one of the relatively few outdoor spaces that young, poor, almost exclusively black kids had to do something productive and healthy.
The reason I knew that's how your story would end is that I've heard similar stories from a number of people. Another hero in this movement is a guy named Frankie Guzman, who's a really effective attorney now, but he spent a number of years in the California Youth Authority, and before that in, I guess what you would call an under-resourced neighborhood, where he used to feel safe by going to the rec center. But the DA advocated and got it closed down because gang members hung out there. But like, think about it. They were hanging out at the rec center. They were looking for something, and it was taken away. And I don't know how we're going to fix that. I mean, closing youth prisons was not easy, but it looks easy compared to the sort of redistribution of resources that would be necessary for every kid to get what they need. And we're not redistributing resources in that way in this country right now. But I think we're in agreement.
Yeah, I mean, look, in an ideal world, every person that we got out of juvenile detention, we were spending, I think it was $300,000 a year per detained youth in San Francisco when I took
It's like
office.
$1 million now.
Because the costs are fixed, basically. As the number of kids go down, we're still paying all this overhead for the building and for the labor. The number goes up and up and up. And there's something really perverse about a society that is willing to invest those kinds of resources in punishment after harm has occurred,
Right.
but not invest those same resources or even a fraction of them in supporting successful early childhood education or housing or nutrition for kids who we know are in neighborhoods that desperately need resources, that are at high risk of over-policing. But the money is not there. And look, we could make analogies. We do the same thing with mental health care. I know, Dale Milfay is in the audience, a longtime mental health advocate. We do exactly the same thing with people who suffer from mental illness. We don't have treatment on demand. We don't have universal access to drug treatment or mental health care. But as soon as they commit a felony, or allegedly commit a felony, we're willing to throw tons of resources. And as a result, jails in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, in Chicago, across the country, jails are the #1 providers of mental health services.
Right.
As someone who's followed this issue, who's worked on it, who's advocated, who's educated the public, what more can and should we be doing to elevate this issue to one that takes the kind of priority stage it deserves?
Well, I would say a couple of things. It comes back to the racialized dehumanization that you were talking about. You're not going to win votes by building basketball courts in poor black neighborhoods, but when I tell people that youth crime is down 75%, very well-informed people are shocked because you just don't read that. Because politically, this trick of saying, hey, you guys are really in danger, but I'm the guy who can save you, it's just magic. So I don't really know, but what you said about mental health, I want to tell a story about a friend of mine, and it's with her permission. But she's now in her 40s, but I've known her since she was 14. Brilliant, brilliant girl, one of my most amazing writers. Her mother was schizophrenic, and she developed some severe mental illness, ended up in People's Park. And when you mix schizophrenia with meth, it's really bad. And some of you might have read about her a few years ago because she in a manic state, gave meth to a child, thinking it was candy. And she became kind of the poster child for why the homeless were dangerous. And, and God, I mean, when she was in juvenile hall for awaiting placement, which I'm for 6 months, I actually was talking to private boarding schools, and she was so smart that they would have taken her, but I couldn't convince probation to take the money that they would use to put her in a crappy group home and put it into educating her. In any case, things got very, very bad for her. And She did this thing, she was arrested, she was going to be charged with attempted murder, which would have been the end of her. And an amazing criminal defense attorney in private practice read one of the stories about her, which linked to an article she'd written as a teenager, and discovered that she was a human being and took her case on. And she's now at the Napa State Hospital. It's not called the Napa State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, but I forget what it's called.
We always just called it Napa.
Right,
but
right.
I know there's a lot more to
but
Napa than
she's
that
not wine
hospital, but that
tasting.
was just, I mean, you know, people go wine tasting, I
Yeah,
hear,
yeah,
but
yeah.
we were
Yeah.
just trying to get our clients or, you know, in or out of Napa
But
when I was.
here's the tragedy. She's doing great. She's been there for 6 or 7 years. She's getting everything she has always needed. She's getting medical care. She's getting mental health care. Her symptoms are under control. She just got her associate's degree, and she's going to go on to get a 4-year degree, and that was the only place she could get it, and she had to go through hell to get it.
Right.
That's not an answer. I think I'm just putting your question back to you. Like, are you asking why do we do this?
Yeah. Why? I mean,
Yeah,
look,
what's wrong with us?
you go to countries in other parts of the world, and obviously resources is part of it, but you could say it's a question of taxation and expenditure. But when we decided to invade Iraq for the second time, you know, Afghanistan, $1 trillion, poof, we come up with the money. Those kinds of price tags could easily create universal early childhood education, right? I have 2 kids in early childhood education right now. It is not free, even in San Francisco. It is massively expensive. And most people can't afford to pay for it, even with both parents working a job.
Okay, I've got it, Jasathan. It's capitalism. No, seriously, like, we don't think poor people deserve things. We're taking away things like food stamps. You know, we're taking away medical care. It's this deeply American idea that if you didn't earn it by contributing to the machine, you shouldn't have it, and your children shouldn't have it.
Does that make us safer or less safe?
Well, that's a leading question.
No. As a lawyer, I have to
As
make
you
that
all
is an
know,
open question. That
As
is
you all know, America is one of the safest countries in the world. We don't have gun violence. No, of course it makes us less safe. And, you know, the other thing is that makes me really mad when I hear this rhetoric. Yes, kids are impulsive. Yes, they've experienced trauma. Yes, their brains aren't in development. But if they didn't have guns, these wouldn't be felonies, right? That if we genuinely wanted safety, we would be getting guns off the streets, not kids. So we don't even want to be safe. And why is that?
I mean, if we go further upstream, the real irony, putting capitalism to the side for a moment, this country seems to care tremendously about kids when they're in utero. But once they're born, good luck, right?
Yes. Oh, are you saying that we're a little hypocritical?
You know, I've heard people talk about that. Yeah, I've heard.
I mean, you know, like, we can joke about it, but, like, maybe somebody out there has the answer. There is something wrong with us. And the closest I think it's race. I think that's our primal sin, and we just keep enacting it again and again through these punitive systems.
I want to follow up on that, but you mentioned the audience and answers. While there may be answers from the audience, and I would love to hear them if they're there, we certainly will have questions from the audience. We have about 15 more minutes for our conversation. Those of you that have questions or answers, if you can fit them on the flashcards, write them. They'll get passed up, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as you have as possible.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Which is a follow-up to your question about safety. So you were the DA. It was your job to keep the city safe. There were people who felt you should be doing it by traditional means. What was your, like, I'm assuming that you took that as your mandate. What did you feel was effective or would be effective? Because it's not like you could control, as the DA, you can't build a park.
No, you can't build a park, you can't expand mental health care or drug treatment, right. Which was really frustrating because some of those things are clearly and obviously part of the solution, as I think our conversation has already made abundantly clear. And yet when you campaign on expanding treatment on demand or mental health services as a tool for prevention of crime and expanding public safety, voters can vote for that, but ultimately the DA doesn't have the budget or the mandate or the capacity to expand those kinds of services.
No, but we can still blame you.
Definitely that. A lot of that happened for sure. Look, this is part of the challenge of change in a democratic society. I think it's appropriate that the DA can't snap his or her fingers and dramatically increase the services offered by the Department of Public Health, right? There are other government agencies. There's the Board of Supervisors, the mayor. There's elected and appointed officials who are responsible for policy change in these other spaces, and even in the criminal justice space. The irony about even the way you framed your question about being responsible for public safety as the DA is that the DA's budget is about 10% of what the police department's budget is. And just to use an analogy, if you go into a restaurant and you order an omelet, the chef might do a really good job making the omelet, or they might do a really bad job, and you can criticize the chef for how good or bad the omelet is. But if there's no eggs in the kitchen, you can't exactly blame the chef for making a bad omelet. But in San Francisco, when I was DA, police stopped making arrests. And for those of you in the audience who identify as abolitionists, you might say, hooray, that's a step towards the solution we imagine. But I think abolition, if it's going to be achieved, is a really long-term goal.
We need to lay the groundwork first.
Yeah, and it's a little bit like the problem we saw in Oregon when they decriminalized all drugs without taking the time to build out infrastructure. It might be a great policy idea, but you still need to figure out how to bridge the gap between where we are today and where we want to get to. I don't care what your vision is for the omelet or for the way a DA should prosecute. If police aren't doing their job, the DA can't do theirs. 99% of cases that police prosecute are brought to them by, that DAs prosecute are brought to them by police. And the single most effective deterrent. A lot of people talk about ratcheting up punishment for these so-called super predators. That's how we got 3 strikes. That's how the death penalty comes back into focus. People say there's serious crimes. People aren't getting, the lesson. We need to punish them more severely. Mm-hmm. What all of the research shows is that the most effective deterrent is not more severe punishment, but rather certainty of detection and arrest. In other words, if people are arrested and they know they'll be arrested, they won't commit a crime, for the most part. Now, let's just take my parents, who were arrested when I was a year old. I was maybe 7 months older than my youngest is when my parents left me at the babysitter and went off and committed a crime for which they both were sentenced to possible life sentences. Right. My parents were highly educated. They weren't mentally ill. They weren't drug addicted. They weren't even interested in getting rich out of the commission of this crime. They had other things that motivated them entirely, but they wouldn't have done it if they thought they were going to get caught.
Exactly.
Right? Nobody would. Even people who are severely mentally ill, if they understand that they'll get arrested, it doesn't matter if the DA is Chesa Boudin or Brooke Jenkins or Donald Trump. People won't nobody wants to get arrested and deal with getting searched and processed through county jail. So, and this is something that a lot of abolitionists don't like to acknowledge, but having effective policing can be a really effective way to reduce and deter crime. The problem is, if we're not being punitive, police won't do their job or be effective. Right. And that's what we saw in my administration, right? If you don't send people to prison for a long time, they're not interested in writing police reports. Right. So that's a bigger, deeper problem that I think we have to confront.
But I think it could be solved if we would just put the National Guard on every corner.
They're trying that in Minneapolis. Let's see how it works out.
No, but in all seriousness, a lot of this is just intuitive as a parent. Like, if you've been a parent, what's going to stop your kid from doing the thing? It's not.
Well, I'd love some advice, because my 4-year-old is waking up every night, multiple times in the middle of the night.
Oh, you're just screwed.
He's coming into our bedroom. He's waking us up. And we've tried lots of different things.
Okay, I'll tell you what we tried, but...
Well, let me tell you what hasn't worked. Getting angry at him or being punitive. Yeah. That hasn't worked.
Okay, so...
Because when he wakes up and he's scared and he's behaving irrationally...
You just got to wait it out. He needs you to... My feeling is...
Who knew I was coming for parenting advice? This is great.
He's scared. No,
I could give that to me on the flashcards, too. I'll keep those to myself.
No, we tried this because we were such, anti-punitive people. We tried this silly thing where we made a treasure chest and we put junk from the dollar store in it, and we told them that every time they stayed in bed until there was light in the windows, because they were quite small, they could have something from the treasure chest. But I'm like the good cop, so if I just gave them the thing anyway. But it didn't work because there's not development. Anyway, we'll talk
Short
later.
term. Well, no, but this is a critically important part of
But
the
also-
conversation about youth decision making and the impulsive behavior and the challenges with thinking that sending somebody to prison for a year longer when they're a kid is somehow going to make not only them but all of their peers in their community change their behavior. It's totally contrary to everything we know about youth.
Yeah, what I was
parenting.
going to say is that, if they're stealing the cookie or whatever, it's getting caught. It's not putting them in
Right.
timeout for 7 years.
Right.
That's that what you're saying is intuitive. But I think what you're talking about, and I don't want to get too deep into it, but it's brain development. You just said your kid is scared, right? He probably really does think there's monsters under the bed.
It's a red light on the space heater we use that he says is the pizza
All right,
man,
you better
but
focus,
yeah,
you better focus.
So I want to, but we started talking about what works and what doesn't work, and I don't want folks to think that your book or your vision is negative, or that the movement that you're documenting is negative. There are a lot of success stories of both individuals and of policies. So I want to share one policy success story, and I'll ask you to share some of the individual human success stories that you've documented and seen, if that's all right. A policy success story that I want to share from San Francisco. And I wish I could take credit for this. I really do. But this started before I was DA. There was a restorative justice program. It's been rebranded a few times, but often referred to as Make It Right, which was set up in San Francisco and developed in partnership with researchers at UC Berkeley to do a randomized control study where young people arrested and accused of crimes, not the most serious, not murder, but a wide array of criminal offenses, were divided into two groups. One group was the control group, and they were prosecuted in the normal way that young people are being prosecuted in San Francisco and in California. And the other group, the experimental group, somebody from the DA's office would call up the victim, and they would ask if they wanted to participate in restorative justice. And what they found over many years of doing this was really, really important and probably not surprising to anybody who chose to come to this event. They found that at the end of the case, overwhelmingly at the beginning of the case, when given the choice, the vast majority of victims, I'm talking about like 90-some%, chose restorative justice. It was the victim's choice. They said we could prosecute them the way we do all these other cases, or we could try this other thing. And victims overwhelmingly wanted this other thing. They didn't want kids to be prosecuted and kept in a cage for longer periods of time. But what was in some ways even more impressive than the front-end data was the back-end data, both for outcomes in terms of victim satisfaction and in terms of recidivism. Because they surveyed victims on both sides of this randomized control at the end of the case. And the satisfaction that victims felt after the restorative justice process was overwhelmingly higher than the satisfaction victims felt after securing a traditional adjudication, a criminal conviction, essentially, against these young people. Now, all that would be enough, probably, to say this is a good idea. But for those people who are really narrowly focused on the public safety outcomes, who say, well, what about recidivism? What about the rates at which these young people reoffend and get rearrested for future crime? Well, again, massive reduction in recidivism rates for restorative justice across almost every category of crime, with a few exceptions, as compared to traditional prosecution. So this is something we know can work. We know it's more humane, it's more cost effective. We know it leaves victims feeling like their case has resulted in justice and accountability. And we know that it actually makes us safer. And yet the current DA in San Francisco and the zeitgeist across the state and the country is to move away from those kinds of policies.
And I think, you used the word accountability. Since I've been doing some interviews for something else with former juvenile lifers who've been released, because there are a series of laws that are allowing for second looks. So after 30 however years, you can have your case revisited, and if you were sentenced to life as a juvenile, which is insane in itself. And what some of these guys told me was, they felt a lot of remorse for what they had done. In some cases, the person they had killed was a friend, a cousin. But when you're incarcerated, when you're put in a room by yourself, isolated from your community, often there's a no contact order with your victim and your victim's family. You're just accountable to the void. This idea that, this very fundamental idea that the solution to crime is time, do the crime, do the time. Like but like, what is the relationship between, as you said, there's no statistical relationship. And in some of these cases, these guys got out and were engaged in restorative justice with the victims of their crime. And as you said, it was the only thing that offered those family members healing. And I think a lot of DAs, not the one next to me, they sell people this false promise that if the punishment is really harsh, they'll get closure. And I've also heard a lot of people tell me that they feel very betrayed by that because, the loss is not remedied by someone else's suffering.
Before we turn to audience questions, I'll just share with you a couple of personal anecdotes about this accountability point you just made. My mother spent 22 years in prison. And she described, not so much in her own case, but something she witnessed and experienced with so many of the women she lived with during those 22 years, which is that it's really hard. The system that we think of, that so many of us think of as holding people accountable, in many ways makes it difficult or impossible for people to take real ownership of what they've done. And so what do I mean by that? Well, you often people are genuinely victimized and they're told by people around them, it's not your fault, this is the product of your environment or circumstance, you didn't have a chance. You get arrested and your public defender, sorry Patty, tells you don't admit anything, we have a defense, don't talk to the police, it was self-defense, or there's a mental health defense, or it wasn't me, it was somebody else, right? And then once you get convicted, you say, well, it was my lawyer's fault. Sorry, Patty. Ineffective assistance of counsel, right? And then you're on this appeal. The judge did me dirty, or the DA misconduct, and you're appealing for years. And then you're 10 years into your sentence. All your appeals are exhausted. You're starting to get ready for your parole board, and never once have you looked at anybody and said, "I did something really terrible. I caused tremendous harm.
Yeah.
Here's how I've learned and grown." And so nobody ever helps you. The system doesn't help you actually take responsibility. My father, who's at home looking after my kids, and that's part of why my wife let me do this event, did 40 years in prison. And he was in prison while I was DA for pretty much the entire time. And he was following closely, as you'd imagine he would be, from across the country where he was in prison in New York. And he said and continues to say that the single policy and practice of my administration that made the biggest difference in the long term in advancing public safety, he thinks our expansion of restorative justice was great, and our expansion of diversion programs was great, and our efforts to have transparency in our discovery policy, all these things I could talk to you about, our victim services. But the single thing that he feels like made by far the most impact in long-term public safety for San Francisco was the dramatic reduction in the number of kids in juvenile detention. Because so many of the men that he spent those 40 years in prison with started off having their lives turned upside down and destroyed by youth incarceration. So I just want to say, before we turn to audience questions, I felt tremendously privileged to be able to do that work. And thank you for making this movement that inspired me and informed my policies accessible to the audience and to so many people across the country.
Thank you. And we'll talk later about the bedtime thing.
Sure, yes. I'm open to any suggestions on how I can get a good night's sleep. So I haven't had a chance to read through all of these questions yet, and there may be more coming up. And let me make sure that I can read handwriting here. So I'm going to start with this one, and while you answer, I'm going to dig in on the other ones. But this is apparently not really a question, but a request for a reaction and thoughts. You say race is the primal sin. Others would say poverty, gender, class, etc. What all of these harms have in common is a need for haves and have-nots, saying any one issue, well, very important and 100% valuable, can obviate underlying psychological void. Some other group will just be made to take the spot. So I guess if I could maybe try to consolidate that into a question, since they acknowledge it's not a question, is...
Which, welcome to the Bay Area.
Hey, it's good, it's good. And look, my parents were part of a movement in the 1960s that split over this question of race first class, right? It was a big, for those of you, I see some people nodding, you're aging yourself here, or dating yourself. But I guess maybe to put as a question, race is a critically important part of understanding what goes on in the criminal justice system. Race and class and gender issues often are intersecting and overlapping and intertwined. Would you agree that class is also a critically important part of understanding what's happening in juvenile justice.
Yes, but it's like a yes and.
Right.
Yeah, obviously, if you are poor, you're much more likely to be incarcerated than you're not going to explain the reasons why. And if you're black and poor, you are still much more likely to be incarcerated. But I think this idea that we can separate race and class in this country is a false dichotomy. There's a study that I've been trying to track down for years, but I know it exists, which looks at the black-white wealth disparity, and it turns out that most of it is actually attributable to disparate incarceration, because when a family member is incarcerated, it's not just the cost of commissary and phone calls, it's the lost wages, the lost caregiving. So when some economists added it all up, and it turned out that it was responsible for a lot of that gap. And then there's obviously the generational stuff. So yeah, I don't mean to just pull on one thread, but as you said, when you went into that facility in Chicago, what you saw was black faces. And
It's true in San Francisco as well, by the way.
It's true everywhere.
Which is really telling in a city that's only 4% black. I mean, Chicago.
Right. No, I remember Vinny Schiraldi, who ran the DC system, saying that the only white kids who came into his facility were there to volunteer. So I'm not going to back away from underscoring that as just kind of pivotal to this system, while acknowledging that class is important. In terms of gender, girls are a lot less likely to be incarcerated, but they're much more likely to be incarcerated for their own protection. A lot of times because they're being trafficked, because they don't have somewhere to live, and for reasons I don't entirely understand, the proportion of girls incarcerated is rising as the numbers are dropping. So yeah, of course, all that's important.
This is another question from the audience, from someone who is working on a documentary aimed at interrupting the school-to-prison pipeline by raising awareness of its existence and trying to humanize the kids caught up in it. The question seems to be one asking for advice about fundraising, but I'm gonna take the moderator's prerogative and take the premise, but shift the question a little bit and say, okay, you are someone who's written about this population and this community. Obviously, documentary filmmaking is a very different medium than book writing, but can you share some suggestions or advice about how to do this work and tell these stories in a way that is both ethical and honest and empowering of the subjects?
That's a great question. So I'm going to steer the questioner to my husband, Tim, in the back row there, because he does publicity for documentary film and is hiding his face, but knows a lot more about it than I do. But from his work, I feel like documentary film is the real journalism now, as journalism is dying. There's a film out now called The Alabama Solution. I don't know if people have seen or heard of it, but it was shot mostly on contraband cell phones inside an Alabama prison, and it's the most remarkable, devastating piece of journalism I've ever heard. But the question how to do it ethically, it's one reason I write instead of doing something like documentary film, because I am very aware of people's privacy. In my last book, Burning Down the House, initially I thought I would ask kids if they wanted their names used or not. Then I thought about adolescent brain development, and I just changed all their names because, there's an argument that by doing that, I was implying there was something shameful about incarceration, and that's a legitimate argument, but the internet is forever. I think what I'm saying is that writing raises fewer of those questions because you can delve very deeply into someone's story without exposing them in the way a documentary film does. And I appreciate the question because I don't think journalists, whatever their medium, ask it often enough.
I'll just echo your comments about the Alabama Solution. For people who haven't seen it, it's really a must-see, but also a film that should come with a trigger warning because it's so traumatic.
Yeah, it took us a couple tries to get through it.
Even for people like Nell, apparently, and myself, who have decades of experience with this work in this space, seeing the images and hearing the stories is really intense, but it's critically important the same way that we not look away from the young people who are being criminalized by gang injunctions or the mother of three who's getting shot and killed by federal officers in Minneapolis. I think we have to remember that there are many hundreds of thousands of people, 2 million people across the country in cages, and many of them are being treated in exactly the way that is so courageously documented by these cell phone videos.
Yeah, I think they're the real authors of the documentary.
They are. And there's real ethical issues there about the risks that they endure. They're adults, not juveniles. That's easier, and there's fewer ethical issues with adults. But the cell phones were contraband, and the videos show very clearly who had them, and they expose horrific violence and criminality by the Alabama Department of Corrections. And the people who made this documentary on the inside have, in many cases, faced very real repercussions and retaliation.
And I mean, this film, you watch on cell phone camera as guards murder someone. I mean, it's recorded, and it's like, I thought when this documentary came out, the sky would break open. I really did. But that's not what happened. It's streamed on HBO. It's still happening in Alabama. The filmmakers have a impact campaign where they're documenting deaths in Alabama prisons. They're continuing apace. Here's what did happen. The FCC passed a regulation allowing prisons to block cell phone signals in the space over them. So when I say that invisibility is essential to maintaining these institutions, the fight to keep them invisible is very hard. So, God bless this filmmaker, because we do have to keep it visible.
We have time for a couple more questions. This next one is from a Berkeley native who now lives in Brooklyn, but apparently traveled all the way here for this event. So that's
Hi, Christian.
kudos. Or maybe there was some other excuse,
Or your
but
roommate.
glad that you're here. The question says that people are shocked when I say I live a block from massive projects, presumably in Brooklyn, and feel safer than when I'm in the Bay Area. The rec center across the street from the projects, the right housing laws, city assistance programs all create less crime and more community bonds. How can these kinds of programs, laws, and New York's new mayor translate to Bay Area legislation and funding? Why is this not replicable here?
That's a question for you.
Maybe, but okay. Because you guys voted me out of office? No.
It's that treatment on demand.
Yeah, exactly. No, I'll say a couple. New York I was born there. It's a great city. It's a very different place politically. They don't have recalls for one thing, but the other thing that's just important, and we'll see what the mayor can accomplish and how much there's entrenched resistance from the police and other parts of the kind of government and bureaucracy to his goals, but. I want to focus in on what isn't really the heart of the question. We could talk about San Francisco politics. I'm happy to do that if we have time, but we have 4 minutes and one more question we're going to get to. So I want to focus in on one word in this question. I live a block from massive projects and feel safer than when in the Bay Area. The Bay Area is, and San Francisco has been and was during my administration, one of the safest cities in the country. If you look at objective data, statistics, reporting, by almost any metric. I know, parts of Oakland and Berkeley are not the same as San Francisco, and there's different neighborhoods within San Francisco, and we can define safety and measure it in lots of different ways empirically. But any way you measure it, San Francisco and Berkeley are phenomenally safe places to live and to walk and to spend time outdoors. But it's true that we don't always feel safe. And so I want to encourage all of you to think critically about how, and this is true for me, it's true for all of us, how we consume news, how we engage with social media, what makes us feel a certain way. The availability and recency biases that so shape the way we feel about crime and public safety often have nothing to do with what the data shows us and everything to do with what we hear from friends or see on TV or in our algorithmic spoon-fed integration with the world. I'm not saying this is a criticism at all. I think it's real, and it's something that I contended with every day that I was in office. And I was a little slow, frankly, in learning the lesson that falling crime rates, which we had during my tenure, and increasing charging rates, we were prosecuting a higher percentage of the cases the police brought us than my predecessor, didn't matter at all if people felt unsafe. So I say this as an answer really to say we need collectively to make sure people feel safe if we want to solve the problems we're talking about
I'm
today.
so glad you said that. And one thing I say in the book is that we care a lot more in this country about making some people feel safe than ensuring that everybody is safe. Because this is something a friend of mine said to me, but one person's safety is another person's danger. I think he was talking about the police, but yeah, feeling safe. You know, and it's very difficult to walk through the Tenderloin and see people who are addicted and homeless. It's not dangerous. It just makes you feel bad.
All right, lightning round, last question. I was supposed to get here 4 minutes ago. We've got 1 minute. What does the system need to do so that the voice of the youth incarcerated is brought to the system? And why should they listen to us if we don't listen to them?
Wait, who are us and them in that?
Why should they, young people, listen to us, telling them don't commit crimes, do this, do that, if we don't listen to their voice?
Oh, yeah, totally.
So how can we make their voices heard? Other than by buying your book and having you sign it after this event.
I mean,
That's your answer.
So I have several chapters on this. God, I don't even know where to start with
Well,
that
you've got
one.
30 seconds.
It drives me crazy when people say, oh, you've done such a good job giving youth a voice. Like, they've got it. They don't need me to give it to them. In the 90s, when I was doing this youth media work, I was doing a lot of panels that I was moderating and kind of mediating. Meanwhile, these kids were out in the street, you know, fighting Proposition 21, trying to stop the super jail in Alameda. I can't answer this quick enough, but youth voice has become a thing. Like, every state has to have an impacted young person on their state advisory council to their juvenile justice system. And the way, when California closed its state youth prison system, they created roles for youth, but what we have now is tokenism. Not entirely. We have super powerful. I mean, you were a youth advocate, right?
Yeah, my first public speaking was advocating for children of incarcerated parents, one of your other great books.
Well, that's how we first
That's how we
encountered
first
each other.
connected. I'm going to cut you off in the interest of
'cause
time.
I'm just gonna.
This is a big topic. It's an important one, but I think the short and the real answer is we buy Nell's book. We tell people about it. She's going to be signing books afterwards. I want to offer, on behalf of everybody in the audience, our thanks to Nell Bernstein, the author of In Our Future, We Are Free. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. This is a really.
Thank you for inviting me to join you in this important conversation. Thank you all for joining us. For more information about membership or upcoming Commonwealth Club World Affairs programs, please visit commonwealthclub.org. I am Chesa Boudin. Thank you, and we'll see you in a few minutes signing books.
Thank you so much.